Let us take a look at the Laredo of the middle 1880s. Laredo had been founded in 1755 and raised to the dignity of an incorporated town in 1767, after which time elections were held each year for city officials. So, city elections became annual events and were conducted with all the vigor of revolutionary uprisings. An old Mexican born in Laredo once remarked to this writer that, quote, "As long as there are two Mexicans in Mexico, there will be revolutions." By the time of the city election on April 6, 1886, the voters of Laredo were divided into two strong opposing political parties. The Citizens Party adopted as their campaign slogan the name Guarache, by which it was universally called. Guarache is the Mexican Indian word, adopted into Spanish, for the sandal composed of a rawhide sole with thongs of the same material used to hold it on the bare foot, and it is the footwear of the most lowly class in Mexico. The opposing party, self-styled Democrats, were mainly composed of the aristocratic element, but with a strong proletarian following. The Mexican nature must have a symbol or a word to distinguish their party, so the leaders adopted the more elegant word bota, boot, for their political battle cry. In all the excitement of the moment of competing demonstrations of Guarache and bota leading up to the election of April 6, 1886, no one has ever definitively stated who fired the first shot that brought on the general engagement between the two forces in the downtown Laredo Plaza. One specter a few days later wrote, quote, "The Guaraches attacked the procession of botas in front and rear, breaking their ranks and scattering them in confusion, flying helter-skelter to places of shelter." A few months after the riot, the good priest, Father A.M. Souchon, testified, quote, "I saw the procession of botas as it marched along. I saw it across the plaza. They were going quietly. They had music with them. I saw the first shot fired, but do not know who fired it. It came from the street northeast from our house. 2 shots fired at the procession. I suppose it was about the east part of that block that the first 2 shots were fired, and the men shot from the north toward the procession. The men who did the shooting were on horseback, and they were running. They shot and ran up the street from the river. A cannon opened on the procession, but being some 2 blocks distant and aimed a little too high, most of the nails and scrap iron fired from the cannon, from which it was loaded, went over the heads of the crowd and struck the top of the old high school annex. The firing continued for some time and then slowed down while the combatants went to seek more ammunition. And on their return, the hostilities, the violence between Guarache and Bota, were renewed with vigor. After the battle had subsided, the Botas reformed and continued their march back on their halt to Iturbide Street, but they were fired on by Guaraches again. It was at this moment that Colonel R.F. Bernard, commanding officer at Fort McIntosh, appeared on the scene with a body of United States soldiers, and peace was restored. The abrupt ending of the fight caused one reporter to wire his paper, quote, "It is impossible to surmise how long the thing would have lasted. It would probably have been a case of the Kilkenny cats, but for the appearance of United States regulars on the scene." Colonel Bernard immediately disarmed all participants without respect to party affiliation, closed the ferry to Nuevo Laredo, and patrolled the town during the night and following day. Thus the election of 1886 in Laredo. But with all the bitter feeling engendered by the riotous conflicts of that campaign, time, the great healer, intervened before the next city election in Laredo the next year, and the hatchet was buried, for in the issue of April 6, 1887, the Laredo Times remarked, quote, "We are a band of brothers," was the appropriate air for the election all day long. Botas and Guaraches fraternized, in some instances the latter voting the only ticket in the field, simply snatching off the head, Democratic ticket. That's the good new way. So peace reigned on the Rio Grande once more. That is from the Laredo City Election and Riot of April 1886 by Seb S. Wilcox in the Southwestern Historical Quarterly of July 1941. I'm Joshua Treviño, and this is The Hard Country.
And welcome to Hard Country. My name is Melissa Ford. I'm a policy director at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and I am joined by Joshua Treviño, the Foundation's Chief of Intelligence and Research. Thank you, Josh, for reading those paragraphs. Before I start with all the questions I have for you today,
Sure.
Would you mind telling us a little bit about why you picked it?
Oh my gosh. Well, before I even say that, Melissa, happy birthday.
Oh, thanks, Josh. Thank you.
I'm glad you're taking time on your birthday to do this podcast with us.
There's nothing else I would rather do.
Okay, that's extremely kind. I know that's not true though. So, I picked it because it's such a. I mean, it's colorful for one thing.
Yeah,
and it really
it was
just,
great.
It
I
really
loved it.
it really shows just how riotous and fractious politics on the border has always been.
Right.
One of the things that we talk about in this podcast is kind of the recurrence of history. How there's nothing really quite new that comes upon this region of the world, really, and probably the rest of the world too. And so what we see is kind of the tumult and violence, and corruption and color and interestingness of the Texas-Mexico border, especially that section of it, is not the exception, but the norm. Often a tragic norm, but in some cases, requiring the intervention of the United States Army to occupy Laredo in 1886, extremely entertaining to read about,
Very.
if not to live through. Laredo is such an interesting city. As you know, those who saw our previous episode know that we were there last week. Laredo is actually my father's hometown.
Yeah.
So we have family roots there, and it's always been an island unto itself. When you get to Laredo, no matter where you're coming from, you've already driven through a minimum of 150 and more commonly 200 miles of essentially nothing. Very arid, sparsely populated South Texas land, and the same is true really if you're coming from the Mexican side as well. Laredo and Nuevo Laredo are a singular conurbation divided by the river. Although their civic lives, unfortunately, are diverging as Nuevo Laredo falls more and more under cartel rule. But Laredo has a very unique civic culture. It's not El Paso. It's not the Valley. It is a thing unto itself, and so understanding it really requires understanding it on its own terms, and with the realization that it is almost this cultural island. There even is. I don't know if there's ever been any scholarship on it. Probably somewhere somebody's done it.
I wonder.
There's even a Laredo accent that you can tell, and so you hear it.
Really?
It's anybody who is. I guess if you're watching this, you're on YouTube already. So if you're on a podcast, my apologies. But if you get on YouTube, go look up the current mayor of Laredo. Same last name as me, Treviño. His name is Victor Treviño. We had the pleasure of meeting him. He was very gracious with his time, and we spoke with him, at length. And listen to his accent, and that is a very distinct accent. I hear it from particular generations of Laredoans, including my own grandmother, who has this accent that's very distinct. And when you hear this talk, this particular accent, you know that these are not individuals who are from, say, the Rio Grande Valley or somewhere else in South Texas. There's nobody else who has it, and I think that the existence of that distinct accent. Which for me, I hear it in English. My Spanish is not good enough to detect an accent in Spanish, so maybe there's a Spanish accent too. I couldn't tell, but really speaks to the cultural isolation of Laredo. A fascinating place. So thank you for indulging me with it.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna be one of the people that are gonna go YouTube that as soon as we're done, because I had no idea. That's very interesting that they have their own accent.
Yeah, and can I say one other thing? I'm sorry about,
absolutely.
It's interesting. I'm certainly not, we're a nonpartisan organization, so I'm not endorsing this mayor or anybody else in terms of candidates or office holders. But the mayor of Laredo, to me, the current mayor, and by the way, we met with the previous mayor too, Mayor Science, who was a very, very generous man, also with his time and attention and allowing us to see a lot of his city. But the current mayor, Mayor Treviño, is actually doing a very good thing in that he is very focused on the history of Laredo. You saw Laredo is a city that dates from the 1750s. Its founder was a captain under Escandon, Tomas Sanchez de la Barrera, who is an ancestor of mine. Also an ancestor of the current mayor. He has a lot of descendants. He was fruitful and multiplied. So there's a lot of people who are descended from Tomas Sanchez. But the mayor made the point in conversation, and I really appreciated this as somebody who's concerned with history and specifically with Texas history, that in Laredo in particular, but really in South Texas in general, you have these cities that are older than the United States itself, that have this very distinctive and unique Spanish and Mexican inheritance that really nowhere else in the United States has, and also with the same original cohort of settlers who came here in the 18th century and who have tended to stay in the same place in the intervening we're now in the 3rd century since the settlement. And so he made the point. He said, not enough people realize that. They don't understand it. Tomas Sanchez, I believe, is actually in Nuevo Laredo. He's buried in Nuevo Laredo because the Nuevo Laredo was established kind of as a sidebar after 1848 when there was a group of Laredoans who did not wish to live under the rule of the United States. And so they decamped to the south side of the river. That's why
it's a new Laredo.
That's why New Laredo is on the south side. That's exactly right. And I believe they took Tomas Sanchez's body here. Somebody on the internet will correct me on that if I'm wrong. But the mayor said, look, we need to do more to establish that. So he is actually building. This is so heartwarming to me, having witnessed the past, 5 years to almost a decade of statues being torn down and history being erased. They're building a heroic, I think, equestrian statue of Tomas Sanchez in Laredo now.
Really?
They've got the land. I don't think construction started yet, but he was saying, the city's going to do it. And the city itself is assuming responsibility for promoting more of the local history there. And so that is incredibly heartening. And I think it's a model for the rest of Texas and maybe the nation.
Yeah.
Because every city, town, and community in the United States has something extraordinary about it. I mean, we're a nation descended of heroes, right? And so to find that element within the local history and to elevate it, to build a heroic statue that does matter, in terms of shaping people's consciousness and their understanding of who brought them there and where they're from, is just incredibly important. So Laredo,
that's awesome.
Laredo's doing something right in that vein. Yes.
Well, I just want to say thank you for starting us off, first of all, with like a very entertaining passage. And then for giving us such a heartwarming tale about that. So, but thank you for bringing us up. Now I'm going to bring us down.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, as we do.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about other things at the border that are not so positive, right? So I'll shift to Laredo in a little bit, but first I wanted to ask you, especially since you were on the border last week, we have just been talking about this week how we've been seeing all these videos and these photos of what's happening at the border.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask you, so the first one happened on Thursday, and it's a photo of what appears to be like a cartel gunman in the area from Piedras Negras to Eagle Pass, Paso del Águila.
Yeah,
and he's holding like an AR platform rifle as he's like shepherding the migrants through the water.
This is the one who's actually in the river, right? And then he escapes back southward.
Right. It was caught by a drone, so you kind of see it coming from above. So that's one shot. And then another one happened a couple days later on Saturday night, and it's in the dark, and it was caught by one of those movement cameras.
Right.
And it shows this group of cartel gunmen, it appears to be, because they're wearing, full-on body armor, and they have their rifles as well and all these guns. And it appears that they're...
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. It was, I think, Fronton,
Texas in Zapata County.
Yeah, that's where it is, in the Rio Grande Valley. And so I just wanted to ask you about that. I know you were just at the border. Did you see people crossing when you were there? Is that something that you expect to see?
Yeah, right. I mean, it's amazing to get the images, right? So
I'll link them too.
I have, please, in the description of the show. I mean, I have run into people coming out of the river before. There was one time, I think I may have mentioned this on a previous episode. I was in Ansalduas Park, which is in Hidalgo County, which is very, very well populated. And I ran into a guy coming out of the river. I mean, he was wet, and he clearly decided to swim the river. I believe he was caught pretty quickly because Border Patrol was swiftly on the scene. So he sort of disappeared over the levee and did that. And then in Del Rio, I think 2 autumns ago, I talked to a group of Venezuelans who'd just come out of the river, and they were not all wet. They had taken a boat across, and were then waiting for their coyote pickup, their traffickers to pick them up and take them inland. So it's not uncommon to encounter people illegally crossing. I'll put it that way. You go enough and you go often enough, and you're going to run into someone. It just depends. What is interesting about the images that we've seen in the past week, honestly, the ones that you highlighted, and you were the one who showed them to me, so thank you for being alert on that, was to see the armed individuals coming through. The guy who was in the river, and apparently he had an AR-15, I think that's the assumption. He's in the river, and I saw the images, and he's kind of holding it up above the water, and he's shooing people across a fording point. That is that image. I was going to say I like that image. I don't like the image because I don't like what's in it, but I like the utility of the image, which is to show that these individuals, and this is something we've talked about over and over and over on the show, they're all trafficked and they're all under the control of men with guns.
Right.
And so we have to understand that the overwhelming probability is that that man did not have a rifle to defend himself from anybody defending the North Bank. Quite the opposite. He had the rifle to terrorize and to keep in line the people whom he was trafficking across.
Of course.
We have to understand that they are prisoners. They are prisoners of men with guns. And whatever voluntary act they undertook to get themselves into the system, once there, they are not free to escape it. And so, it'll probably sound like a broken record for those who have listened to episode after episode, but shutting down that traffic is the most humane thing we can do for them, for their sake. Now, the individuals crossing in Zapata County. Now, for those who don't know, Zapata County is extremely sparsely populated. There's two counties between, I think, Hidalgo and Webb, so McAllen and Laredo up on the border, and it's Star and Zapata. And the viewer will forgive me if I've left out a county, but I believe that's the case. I think the whole riverfront is I think it's Cameron, Hidalgo, Star, Zapata, and then Webb. And so Star has about 60,000 people. It's huge. Star also has a very interesting political history too, which we won't get into too deeply here. It used to be merged with another county to its north, and it was split circa 1900. I don't remember the exact year, because there was an Anglo political machine and there was a Mexican-American political machine, and the Guerras controlled the Mexican-American political machine, and so they created Star County so the Guerras could control their own county seat. That was the kind of political horse trading that went on. But in any case, Star's got about 60,000. Zapata County is extremely sparsely populated. I didn't look up the population figures before coming on the podcast, but if Star has 60,000, I think Zapata has less than 10,000 people in it.
Oh, it's tiny.
It's very, very small, very, very remote, very far-flung, just a lot of not much. And so these individuals crossing in Zapata, when you cross in, there are two kinds of crossers, to kind of oversimplify a little bit. There's a crosser that wants to be caught because they believe that as soon as they get into the federal system, that they'll be processed, released, transported inland, which is frequently true, unfortunately. The individuals who are crossing at remote points who don't want to be caught, those are the people who are genuinely, in themselves, genuinely dangerous. The whole traffic is dangerous, but these are the ones who, as an individual, are dangerous. And so I run into, I've had close encounters, I would say, with people out in Presidio County, which is way far to the west, and even more remote than Zapata County because it's like the size of New England, and saw signs of a crossing, and I left immediately because if you're crossing in Presidio County, you clearly don't want to be found, and I didn't want to be found because at the time I had my Toyota and myself, and that was it. And so I didn't feel particularly secure. But these are people that you don't want to meet. Or if you do meet them, they will typically, and you can talk to ranchers out in Zapata County, as we did last week, who will, get basically guns pointed at them and say, leave here, don't come back for another 30 minutes. We're going to use your land.
Terrifying.
We're going to cross over. And they're either trafficking people. Sometimes that happens. There have been, anecdotal reports of individuals who are guarding groups and they're coming across, and and it's not, they're not necessarily trafficking them so they can go work in kitchens in Nashville, right? Sometimes these are women who are and girls who are trafficked into a much more malevolent trade. And so sometimes you'll have that, and then sometimes there'll be individuals who will just have backpacks, and the assumption is that they're carrying fentanyl or heroin or whatever kind of controlled substance is in their packs. The images that it was Bill Malugin, right, from Fox News who did it. One of the great border reporters of our age. One of the few guys you can count on one hand. Bill Malugin, Bethany Blankley, Anna Giaratelli, who's our friend from CIS, who does such amazing work. It's Bensman, Todd Bensman. People like that. David Ogren, people like that do outstanding work. They're a minority within the journalistic community who, by and large, simply don't care to report on this, or if they do report on it, it's through the lens of domestic politics. So it was Bill Malugin at Fox News who got this imagery of these individuals who are in military-style gear, and they're each it's a line of them, if I recall correctly. Was it a single person, or was it a line?
The one from the cameras?
Correct.
It was a line.
It was a line.
Yeah,
yes,
there was multiple.
And they all had rifles, and they all had packs on, and their faces were covered, I think. Which is pretty remarkable, given that it's 110, 111 degrees there. And so even at night, it's in the 90s in this part. But they don't want to be found. They want to go through the brush, and they're well armed. And these are individuals, unlike the guy in the river, who was carrying his arms, his personal weapon, to use against the migrants.
Yeah.
These people in the United States heading north are carrying arms to fight off you and me if
Right.
we're out there hunting or we're a ranch owner or something like that. And that is qualitatively different. You might call it invasion. But just imagine that if this one thing is caught, and look, you and I have both, you and me and our colleagues, we've talked to numberless at this point, ranchers, landowners, South Texas residents who've had these encounters over and over and over.
Oh yeah.
I remember talking
It's
with
a common thing for them.
It almost is a common thing. What do you remember the time that you ran into people in military gear and they were carrying sidearms and what happened? And you're usually told to get out of the way. Like, thank God they're not all killed. Some of them are sometimes. I remember talking with a gentleman, this is several years back, in the Rio Grande Valley, and he and a buddy were fishing, and somebody came out of the brush and held him at gunpoint. They had to go face down and wait until whatever was crossed, and then they were told not to sit up and look around for another half hour until everybody had departed. This is happening on U.S. soil.
Oh yeah.
And so we need to. I'll close with this because this gets me hot, and I don't want to get too angry on the podcast. But this kind of thing, when you have it, and let's say you're a landowner, let's say you're an American citizen on American soil, and you have arms-bearing men from another country coming onto your land, and denying you use of your land, curbing your activities, putting you under threat. What's your rational expectation? The rational expectation is that the United States of America will protect you, because that is the bargain that you make, the implicit bargain that you make when you subject yourself to and enter into the social compact with small d democratic governance. We have talked with ranchers. I don't have permission to use their names, but and I may have mentioned this on the previous podcast, but it's worth re-mentioning if I did. We talked with one rancher who had roots that go back in this region in Zapata County or in Starr County in particular, as long as mine do,
Yeah.
And so there's a house in the plaza in Roma, Texas, the Ramirez house that one of my ancestors built, and across the street from it is an even nicer house called the Guerra house that this guy's ancestor built, and it's a much nicer house. And so he and I both have like this long-standing presence, with the difference that he's still there. And he said, look, I'm a landowner here. My family's been here for centuries. I served in the army. I'm a loyal American. I believe in everything. Why has the United States abandoned me? Why have we been abandoned? Like all of our community, does it not care anymore? And if that's the case, now this is not where he went, but when people start asking a question like that, that is incredibly dangerous for civics and for society and for the longevity of a legitimate state. And the questions that get raised become increasingly fraught. Wise statesmanship would short circuit all of it by closing the border and securing it. And then people wouldn't ask questions like that, and then you wouldn't have to answer them. But wise statesmanship is not in evidence on the border these days, especially not coming from Washington, D.C.
No, definitely not. And we heard very similar stories even in El Paso, about entire families that had to move away because they feared for their lives. They had been threatened by cartel gunmen. I think one of those families, this is really sad, but they got all of their pecan trees burnt down by the cartel gunmen because they didn't listen to we heard some crazy stories.
Really?
Yeah. And so I think the last thing that I want to say about that is I really want to make it clear and reiterate what you just said, that this is what we're talking about when we talk about an invasion, right?
Right.
Because I think a lot of the time people, and especially the media, they try to frame that when we talk about invasion, we're talking about an invasion by the migrants, and we're not. We're talking about the invasion by the cartels.
Exactly.
And I think that's why these images, especially the one of the cartel members that don't want to be seen, that are coming in here wanting to cause harm and wreak havoc on our land, that's exactly what we're talking about when we talk about an invasion and the dangers of an invasion.
Yeah.
And then one more thing that I'm sure that you can say, just having come from the border and having met with people there, this is the result of uncontrolled migration, right? I mean, all of the people on our borders and our law enforcement, this is what they're dealing with.
Yeah.
They're so overwhelmed that this is what's coming in when no one can see it. It's leaving all these gaps on our border, and this is what's happening. This is the result of that.
That's right.
And so, yeah, and unfortunately, I just want to shout out the governor, because unfortunately, people are standing in his way when he tries to do something about that.
Right.
And just one of many examples, I think this happened last week, the Eagle Pass City Council situation.
Sure, yes,
So
please.
basically, yes, the City Council had this vote and decided to rescind an affidavit that had been placed where it put this park, this Shelby Park, in custody basically of the governor, right? So it gave a park to the governor. And this happened about a year ago, that it became the governor's property. And it's this, Karine was just there, one of our colleagues, Karine.
Yes.
It's basically this park with sports fields and walking trails, and it's got a boat ramp so people can go into the water.
It wasn't personally the governor's property. It was they basically allowed use of the park by the executive branch. Okay,
Yeah. But what they did this last week, because the governor had been using it for the border initiatives, and that's where the shipping containers were placed, and it was instrumental in placing the buoys as well.
Sure.
But what happened last week, after over, I think, an hour or two of listening to complaints, like a town hall, I guess, essentially, is they decided to rescind that and put it back in the name of the mayor so that the governor can't use it anymore. And so I just thought that was a really good example of what's happening with people standing in the way of the governor and what kind of lengths people are willing to go to make sure that the border remains unsecure.
Yeah, it's almost become an ideological battleground, right? So you saw, you saw Joaquin Castro, for example, going to the border this past week, and he stands at the fence and sort of does his photo op, and then he says that he went on record telling press that he was going to urge the Department of Justice to prosecute Texas state troopers for murder. That was his phrase. Not much. I'm not paraphrasing. He said we're gonna encourage them to be prosecuted for murder if they force anybody back in the river, or force anybody to try to go back and cross, which is a crazy thing to say. And from a naked political perspective, if the other side wants to have that conversation where they're attacking Texas lawmen who are trying to secure the border, then you're free to commit that kind of political suicide as you will. But, we're not a partisan organization. Our goal is to see what's best for Texas, and it's extremely disheartening to see that it has become this. I think this brings up an interesting point too, which is that the population. You're talking about the individuals who had their pecan orchard burned, the ranchers that we spoke with, the people who have been forced out of their homes. What do they all have in common? Almost all of them are Mexican Americans whose primary language is Spanish.
Right.
It is obvious throughout that the population down there, which is a traditionally Spanish-speaking, traditionally Mexican, Spanish-descended population that's been there for centuries, are the ones who are suffering the most from the unsecured border, and they know it, and they're crying out for help. And what's very, very interesting is that the ideological, again, I don't want to get partisan here because we're not, we're 501c3, we're not affiliated with any party organization, nor will we be, or campaign. But when you talk about ideological coalitions in American governance, and we're conservative, so we're part of an ideological coalition. It has been conservatives who have been focused on the working class, on working Americans, who have actually been very sensitive to the pleas from this constituency that if you go by kind of the left's theory of class and race and ethnicity, should be in lock with them. And on the flip side of that, it is sort of these ideologically motivated, frequently upper income Anglos who are completely deaf to the cries for help and the pleas for help of individuals who own land in South Texas, who are Mexican American, who are Hispanic, and who simply want to be allowed to live their lives in dignity as they deserve as citizens of the United States. That to me is absolutely glaring. You saw the differential in response. So South Texas communities with Hispanics can get ravaged by the cartels, by trafficking, by everything, and suffer the effects of it in innumerable ways. And on a national level, media and kind of the regime structure doesn't really care that much. Doesn't really care what happens to these communities. It's just reality. They don't. A few dozen migrants arrive in Martha's Vineyard, on the other hand, and impinge upon the lives and daily routine of the folks there. And you can look up the demographic characteristics of Martha's Vineyard for yourself. It won't surprise you. Suddenly, that's a crisis. Suddenly, that's a great moral thing, and it speaks volumes.
Close to home.
Oh, sure. It speaks volumes as to the priorities of the regime in Washington, D.C. and who it really serves. And I think that in the fullness of time, and frankly, I hope that in the fullness of time, it's going to lead to a realignment that will be to the regime's disfavor in the long run.
And will you share, I think this is relevant, you haven't said this on the podcast yet, but you shared it with me. Will you share real quick what you were told from the South Texans, how a lot of people will go for photo ops but never follow up?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for bringing that up. Well, yes, that is one thing that we heard from folks, ranchers in particular in South Texas, and they were pointing the finger at me and our colleague. Because to them, we were just yet another example of individuals from Austin and from Washington, D.C. who come through and we have discussions and roundtables and express concern, and then we go back and from their perspective, nothing happens. Thanks. And so we had a guy tell us that a United States senator, I won't say who, but a United States senator just came through here, several days back. We've had congressional delegations come through. We've had individuals from Austin, from Capitol Hill, and they show up. And they express concern and say, oh, we got to do something. I said, well, you're in the Capitol. Why don't you do something? And again, they were pointing at me. I'm doing what I can do, which is basically make a podcast and work in policy. But they're not wrong. They're not wrong to have that sentiment.
Yeah.
They're not wrong to ask, okay, thanks for using us as a photo op. Thanks for expressing concern. But it's time for action. It's past time for action.
Yeah.
These are individuals who deserve and need and require the government, to which they pay tax dollars, right?
Right.
For buy-in of the people, ought to step in on their behalf, and it is failing to do so. One thing that we looked at in our research here at the Foundation, especially on an Article 1, Section 10 state invasion declaration. So for those of you who want to look up our research on the Compact Clause and how it's interpreted under Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, because we've done a lot of really good, original, and I think very compelling, I'm biased, but very compelling work on what invasion means under the Constitution and how a state can declare it. But one of the things that we talked about, look, you read it, and one of two things will happen: either you'll be much better informed, or your insomnia will be cured. And so either way, it's a win. It's a win for you. But our researcher whom we worked with, mentioned that the founders never envisioned. There was one scenario that the founders never envisioned. They never envisioned a scenario. Didn't consider it. There's nothing in the Federalist Papers. There's nothing in the constitutional debates. They never considered a scenario in which the federal government would fail to defend the United States. They really didn't. It didn't cross their mind. It wasn't that they thought about it and they said we don't need to plan for it. There was nothing there. There was no thought that any scenario like this could arise that would not generate a response from a truly Republican, small r Republican government. And the fact that is happening now puts us into new territory, I think, and we just got to be aware of it.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah, I mean, these people have all the right to be demanding that from their government, and it's really sad that they're not getting it, and I can't imagine how frustrating that must be.
Oh, yeah.
But since we're on the topic of the border, I wanted to ask you two things related to the U.S. government's CBP1 phone app.
Oh, sure.
I know one of them you had made commentary on online, so I wanted to ask you if you could share a little bit about that with our listeners. But I've been seeing there are all these new claims about how Mexican cartels have been exploiting the CBP1 app, and they've found these new innovative ways to basically make an unlimited number of appointments from anywhere. So you don't even have to be in the geofenced location of southern Mexico,
right,
or to be able to make an appointment. And so they're exploiting that, and they're just having a field day. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. What an amazing example of DC disconnect. This idea that you can solve or mitigate the migration crisis by providing migrants from the Guatemalan highlands with iPhone apps that you could use. So the idea with CBP One, which you can go to the Android store, App Store, or whatever, and download. Anybody can. Is that you can get on your phone and make an appointment, essentially to make a case that you should be admitted to the United States, whether as an asylee or anything else, via your phone. And so you log in, you get your appointment, and then you're good. And the idea is that you won't migrate north if you do that. It's completely not how it's actually worked, obviously, because it's not like people are staying in Tegucigalpa and then making an appointment and then catching an aircraft, a plane flying into Matamoros and crossing the border to do it. That's not what's happening. What's happening is that people are on the way are trying to make their appointment. And CBP1 has been just plagued with issues from day one, and set aside just the really bizarre assumptions that went behind it. That this is a population that you can access it through smartphones.
That has iPhones already.
It's the kind of thing that people who work for people who live in Kalorama think. It's so detached. But set that aside. Let's assume everybody's got access to it and things like that. So what they've done is they basically geofence the utility of the app. You can't make your appointment if you're north of Mexico City. And so what's been happening? I talked with somebody knowledgeable who told me that what was happening was that the trafficking cartels, were then selling VPN access, virtual private network access, so people could claim to be from anywhere. So they could be in Matamoros, right up on the border, but they could get a VPN in wherever it was, Chiapas or Panama. And making their appointments there. So that came out. There was a DHS spokesman who came out and said, well, that can't be true because the geofencing doesn't rely upon VPN IP address. It relies it's a GPS signal. So there's actually it's much more objectively location based. Well, so here's the thing. In either case, the CBP1 app is a failure on its own terms. What it has done is it has provided upsell opportunities for the trafficking cartels in either case, and it hasn't resulted in a measurably diminished flow of individuals northward. The only thing that's done that has been the extremely oppressive summer heat in the region. So for the sake of argument, let's say that you can VPN in. The traffickers now get to charge for a VPN. But let's say you can't. They're still charging for it because, again, it's another upsell opportunity that they have. So, my recommendation would be for the federal government to, stop creating new market niches for the traffickers and shut down the border. That might be the most opportune thing to do. Yeah. Eventually they'll get to it. I just hope it's not too late.
Yeah. And it's interesting, as you say, there's such a big disconnect, right? But I don't think No, it's not. I don't think. I know the Biden administration doesn't realize the lengths and the depths that the cartels are willing to go to rake in more profit.
100%.
Which is insane.
And they're sophisticated too. It's not beyond their ken to do technical work and app development.
They're very organized. Very sophisticated, as you say, but they are not the only ones taking advantage of the CBP1 app. And that's the second thing that I wanted to ask you about is apparently a little while back, the Biden administration had to completely shut down the app after they started receiving complaints and tips that Mexican immigration officials were using the appointments to basically threatened the migrants that were coming in through southern Mexico. Because as you know, like the CBP1 app, if you have an appointment, it functions kind of like a visa, right? If you have an appointment, they will let you in. Right. But that they were using that, they saw an opportunity there. And as we've talked about lots of times, corruption is kind of the grease that keeps the wheels turning in Mexico, which is not surprising. It's that way in a lot of Latin America. But that these immigration personnel were basically threatening to make migrants miss their appointments and taking their passports and all of these things if they didn't get cash for it. So they were saying essentially, and there's, I'll link the article that I got this from, but there are stories of people, real people, talking about their experience here. And one man from Venezuela talks about how him and this big group were asked to pay money. They were told essentially like, put some money in this envelope and like, we'll see what we can do. But they got their passports taken away from them, and they got threatened that they would miss their appointment if they didn't get kickbacks.
Because if you have an appointment, you're even more motivated to get there and to pay whatever extortion is demanded of you.
Is this surprising to you at all, or not?
Unfortunately not. I mean, it's appalling. Yeah. But I wish it was surprising.
Yeah, it's very sad. But so we know Mexico's corrupt, right? Like, it's no news flash here, but I wanted to take that to ask you about some of the corruption that's happening here in Texas, because the U.S. is not immune to all of that corruption. And you were just there, so this is actually very relevant. But yesterday we were reading that the Stark County sheriff's son pled guilty to federal charges for looking the other way on a cocaine shipment and getting paid in cash.
Yeah.
Have you heard of that?
I've read the news story. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I wanted to bring that up because this is a point that we make all the time, and a really good example of something that we've done research on and something that we talk about often, which is the elites are enabling the cartels to thrive.
That's right.
And this is not talked about enough, but it happens all the time, especially a lot of the time in South Texas and with prominent figures. Obviously, it happens in Mexico too, but this one hit close to home, I feel like, because you guys were just there.
Yeah, it does. We've talked a little bit about this on previous podcasts. There's a pretty robust record of sheriffs and sheriff's department officials being in league with the cartels here in Texas. And, you saw it this is many years back, but Sheriff Cantu in Cameron County, and then much more recently, Sheriff Treviño, fellow Treviño in Hidalgo County. He and his son, who is also in the sheriff's department, were in league with Los Zetas, I believe. There was a sheriff out in Presidio County, and now we have this new story of the son of the sheriff of Starr County, Texas.
Yep.
So father and son both named Fuentes. And I haven't followed the case closely, so I don't know what the range of evidence was. What they convicted him on is not necessarily the same thing as what he did. So there's probably more to it. We can't necessarily assume that anybody else was involved. Might have been a bad apple in the family. Who knows? But we should be rationally skeptical. And look, this guy was a lawman. He was there. So you have to ask yourself if you live in Starr County, if you live in San Ignacio, if you live in Zapata, Texas, or anywhere else, if you have to call the police, if somebody's on your land and you're being threatened, or you feel like there's an issue, and if you have to call the sheriff's department, how much confidence can you have necessarily? Ultimately, you have no choice but to trust your sheriff and trust your local PD if you're in a organized urban area. But that adds another layer of risk and kind of this fraught quality to life there. And Americans shouldn't have to worry about that. Yeah, honestly.
Yeah, well, I know we're running out of time, but do you have a minute so that we can talk about a little bit Mexican drama and end on a high note?
Sure, yes.
Okay.
Let's end on a high note,
because I meant to ask you this for the last podcast, but I wanted to ask you your thoughts on the Vicente Fox comments, the former president of Mexico. Yeah, yes, this is 2 weeks ago.
Vicente Fox speaking too much.
Yes, so he said a couple things. So first of all, he, aimed some shots at AMLO because apparently AMLO discontinued benefits for retired presidents. And so he started by talking about that, saying that he's really been struggling to survive economically. Yeah. And then he shifted gears and talked about some less well-off beneficiaries of welfare and how there's no place for them in Mexico. There's no place for lazy people in Mexico.
AMLO said this, or Vicente Fox?
Vicente Fox. Yes.
Okay.
So AMLO, I don't think would ever say that because that's the reason that people like his party so much, right? Is because they're getting...
who knows?
Well,
he might. He's a family values guy. Anyway, go on,
well,
please.
We never know. But I wanted to ask you about that because then he managed to offend all sorts of people across the line. So right now, he's offended politicians, he offended pensioners, and then obviously Ebrard and Sheinbaum came out and condemned his comments, right? And so he flipped on Twitter and went ahead and called Sheinbaum a Bulgarian Jew and called Marcelo Ebrard a French snob. And then he tweeted that the only real Mexican is Xochitl
Galvez.
Yes, her. Yes. Because she was
she's indigenous.
She was the coordinator of indigenous affairs in his cabinet.
Yes.
And as you know, he's a longtime political rival of AMLO, and he's really supporting her.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask you what you thought of that, and if you think that this association will benefit her, or if you think she should distance herself a little bit because he's proving to be a liability.
Well, don't take my word for anything in Mexican politics. I don't think association with Vicente Fox is it's not as much of a con as association with Calderon, but he's not. I don't see any evidence that he's a big vote getter. What he said was legitimately offensive, and I speak as somebody who is not easily offended. But Claudia Sheinbaum is Jewish. She's from a I don't remember what her family origins are. I think both her parents are immigrants.
Yeah, her father's family immigrated from Lithuania, and then mother's family from Bulgaria.
Oh, I didn't know. So I didn't know. So she actually is half Bulgarian. I mean by descent, right? So anyway, yes. But so you, I mean, you can say that, and that's actually. So in fairness, it speaks well of Mexico that there's plenty of Ashkenazi Jews from the middle of the 20th century who were able to find refuge in Mexico.
Oh, yeah.
There's a big synagogue there that's near Parque Alameda, I think, that kind of testifies to that, and that actually is a positive note in Mexican history. That being said, deploying Bulgarian Jew as a dismissal actually is legitimately offensive.
Yeah.
I'm no fan of Claudia as a politician, but she doesn't deserve to be smeared that way. Marcelo Ebrard, I didn't know he was. Is he of French descent? Is that true?
He is,
okay, well, how far off?
It didn't say. I looked it up, and it just said that his family, they were all French immigrants.
Oh, really?
But
okay.
I just wanted to say, I think it's funny because Vicente Fox himself is, of Spanish and German lineage. So.
Oh, I didn't even know that. I didn't know that Fox was of German lineage. So maybe that's an extra frisson. What Fox said was stupid and legitimately offensive. Ebrard being French, okay. Ebrard being a snob actually might be true, but again, does it comport with the dignity and just kind of the normal duty to charity and kindness? No, it doesn't. Now, all that said, and allowing for this phenomenon of old man on Twitter, which is one of the signals of our age, Fox, in the most offensive and inexcusable way possible, has gotten to something kind of at the core. There's about 100 different ways he could have put it that would have been, acceptable and kind to do it, but has gotten to the core of why Xochitl Galvez is threatening to the Morena candidates, because if you want to put like quotes around it, like a real Mexican, if you could even define what a real Mexican is, but certainly given the indigenista ideology that suffuses Mexican governance right now, Galvez is more of a, again, put in quotes, real Mexican than anybody else in the field. She's actually indigenous. She's. Do you know what her is? She Nawa? Is she what is she?
No, I don't know. I need to look it up. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But anyway, that's interesting. Yeah.
I just want to tell you something funny and close on something funny.
Okay. Go ahead.
I think that Scheinbaum is actually threatened because she's been accused of being a foreigner before, but she tweeted out she had to do this, right? Because people are accusing her left and right that you're not a Mexican, you're not a Mexican. She tweeted out her birth certificate recently. Did you see that?
Yes, I did. She was born in Mexico City, wasn't she?
Yeah, so she tweeted that out, and I just thought it was funny because then she made just this very cringy statement saying that she's more Mexican than mole. And
she's more Mexican than mole?
She said that, yeah. So I just wanted to end on a funny note.
I dissent from that estimate, but I agree that she's Mexican. So there we go.
Well, anyway, thank you, Josh, for being on today.
Thank you, Melissa.
And thank you for the conversation. And thank you to all of our listeners. We will see you next time.